Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we examine Britain's long, slow farewell to Europe. The talks in the trade agreement are now not just in injury time, but the injury time of extra time. And it's unlikely that the bells will be ringing across the continent when Big Ben bongs in the new year in London. Today, we take the long view, because these talks in Brussels are not just for Christmas, but forever. First, we talk to the only minister who was as renowned as Margaret Thatcher in the Tory government of the 1980s, the irrepressible Edwina Currie. We ask this born-again Brexiteer whether Europe, the issue which has haunted the Tory party for half a century, has finally been laid to rest. Then we turn to former leader of the Ulster Unionist Mike Nesbitt MLA and ask him whether Boris Johnson has broken 2 unions for the price of 1. And we ask rebel Scottish nationalist Angus MacNeil MP why Northern Ireland has stolen a march on Scotland. But first to Alex with your tweets, emails and messages.
Well, lots of reaction to last week's show with Professor Luca Neal of Trinity College Dublin and Dr. Chris Smith of Cambridge University. They were talking about COVID vaccines and also about what they called a common sense Christmas. And that's been drawn into sharp relief this week with the dramatic joint declaration from the British Medical Journal and the Health Service Journal to politicians about the consequences of the proposed Christmas relaxation. But on the vaccine issue, Terry says, where would we be without these fantastic scientists? Chris, in particular, manages to get complicated messages across in a way that's easy to understand. Norma Johnson reminds us that 4,000 people a day currently dying in the US, going up every day. I think a vaccine is very necessary. Anne Jordan says, now where did you get your info, Norma Johnson? I'm on this side of the ocean. It's about 2,300 a day, but that is still too many. Stuart Martin sounds a note of scepticism. He says, Norma Johnson, you won't find many that disagree, but anyone in any sense won't trust an untested vaccine rushed through. Well, Brad Carr says, check out the brand new book by the CEO of the World Economic Forum titled The Great Reset. Way too many convenient coincidences coming out of all this. But Ian Middleton says, the virus is highly contagious and could easily run out of control and swamp our health services. It's not just about the mortality rate. Now back to Tasmina.
Back in the day, Edwina Currie was almost as well known as Margaret Thatcher. In her years in politics, she's seen 4 Tory prime ministers fall on Europe. So has Boris lanced the boil and got Brexit done, or are there further traumas to come? Alex is in conversation with Edwina Currie.
Edwina Currie, welcome back to the Alex Salmond Show.
It's a pleasure to be here with you again.
Now, this Christmas drama in Brussels, is this going to be the end of it one way or another? I mean, when Big Ben bongs in Hogmanay at midnight, will that be the last time we have this sort of crunch talk and a standoff in Brussels?
Well, I think we all hope so. And it looks as if that might be the case. I mean, the UK is prepared to go out with no deal. Our business people have been at this point so many times before. Everyone's going to be heartily glad to see the back of it. We are sick and tired of Brexit. We're sick and tired of all the rows. We'd just like to get on with earning a living globally, which is what we've been doing for hundreds of years.
But Edwina Currie, when I remember you were a pretty fervent pro-European. You were one of the few Tory ministers who was prepared to stand up for Britain's place in Europe. And what's happened? You're a born-again Brexiteer now.
Well, that was then and this is now. Yes, you're absolutely right. I stood for the European Parliament in 1994. I looked at standing again in 1999, but I think opinion was by then beginning to be really quite critical of Brussels. I like the idea of a big international group of nations coming together voluntarily, countries which had fought each other. We used to throw bombs at each other and bomb each other's cities flat. And I like the idea of these countries coming together in peaceful trade. I think what had happened, though, by the Maastricht Treaty was that it was clear that some of the people in Brussels had more ambitions than that and wanted to build a United States of Europe. And a lot of Brits just began to feel uncomfortable. By the time we got to the referendum, I campaigned to stay in Brussels, I campaigned to stay in Europe, but we lost. We lost, and I'm a great believer in democracy. And increasingly, actually, during the negotiations, the more difficult, the more obscure and obscurantist, that's the word I'm looking for, more just bloody-minded Brussels became, the more I thought to myself, they're not interested in trade. They're interested in bringing this rebel to heel. And the more hostile I found myself becoming. And that was what I was finding on the doorsteps up here in the north of England as well. So I'll be glad to be done with it. I'll be glad to be out of it. And I'm quite sure we will thrive perfectly well without being told what to do any longer by the EU.
But last week there was this talk by the Ministry of Defence about deploying the Royal Navy against French fishermen. I mean, isn't European peace, is that just a whiff of this gunboat diplomacy that perhaps European peace can't be taken for granted?
Well, you do realise, of course, that we have 4 naval fishing patrol vessels anyway, and that they check all sorts of ships, including those, for example, from Russia, to make sure that they are using the right size nets, they're not taking more than their catch, and so on. It's one of the reasons why the North Sea is thriving and fish stocks have recovered so well, whereas the Mediterranean, which is substantially controlled by the EU, is empty of fish. So it's an important thing that we're doing in conservation terms.
But Edwina Currie, I mean, geographically, Britain can't sever itself from Europe. We're a European country. We're 4 European nations, like it or not. Isn't that the reality?
Oh, of course it is. And nobody wants to sever ourselves from Europe. The question is how we will trade in future. And nobody is saying that our trade will stop. That's the kind of story that's put across, Alex, by Remainers, who we call now Remoners, right? But the idea is that we should have trade as free as possible. And the kind of tariffs that are being talked about, which would be applying under WTO rules, World Trade Organization rules, are relatively small. And also, if you take into account exchange fluctuations, our exchange fluctuations of sterling against the euro are much larger than any tariffs would be. So I don't think there's going to be a problem. Plus, we're a very, very competitive market, very competitive. If we can't get our avocados from Spain, we'll get them from Peru. If we can't get our Prosecco from Italy, we'll import it from Chile or Australia. And we will raise a toast to prosperity as we do so. You watch.
Edwina Currie, I was interviewing Bertie Ahern, the former Taoiseach of Ireland, and he made a point. He said, look, getting new markets is all very well, but you don't give up the ones you've got as you're seeking new markets. Isn't there a good amount of Irish sense in what Bertie Ahern has to say?
Yes, of course, because nobody wants to give up markets. We're not giving up markets. You know, nobody's building a wall and saying to British lorries, you can't come in here, especially if they're bringing parts to build Volkswagen in Germany. You watch. And similarly, we're going to be quite relaxed about it. In fact, the government has already said that there won't be a build-up of traffic at ports like Dover. The idea is to bring all the traffic in and then redirect it. And if it needs checking, and it might need checking because it could have contraband of one kind or another. It could have illegal immigrants in, for example, really desperately wanting to leave France and come to Britain. But if it needs checking, then it can be checked away from the port where there shouldn't be any congestion. We are not cutting off ties with Europe. We're not cutting off any ties with EU countries or with the hundreds of millions of people who live there. They will continue to be extremely welcome when they want to come here. And it'll be a very, very light regime. We're long-standing companions and compatriots and partners and neighbours. I really don't see that being a problem. What I do see is that we will develop much closer relationships with the rest of the world, because the EU itself is a protectionist operation. It sets up barriers against the rest of the world. And the rest of the world has been growing an awful lot faster. We see that as being incredibly beneficial to the UK and indeed in the end to Europe as well.
But isn't there a huge historical anomaly here? I mean, it was Margaret Thatcher, your Prime Minister, when you served in government, who more than any other figure created the single marketplace. Was there really a prospect of leaving that Margaret Thatcher creation?
Oh, you're quite right, because when we joined the European Economic Community, as it was then, it was really, there wasn't anything to do with trade. I mean, there wasn't much going on. There wasn't a lot of trade going on. And it was Margaret that drove through the idea that what you have to do is get rid of barriers and get rid of attempts to keep out other people's goods and services. We're not trying to do that at all. We never have done. And she pushed hard for this to happen. And it went alongside the other freedoms, so freedom of movement of capital. Well, that's not going to change. Freedom of movement of goods and services. Actually, there isn't any, even now, a treaty about the single market for services. If we want to buy insurance from AXA, a German company, well, we do. And I have not the least doubt that they will continue to sell it to us. And the freedom of movement of people. Now, that's caused all sorts of problems, partly because we are a main destination for people coming from the other side of Europe. You know, they trudge through European country after European country, and they want to get to Britain because here they are treated with more dignity and more equality than in many other countries in Europe. So I think there are lots of lessons there, lots of lessons. But what we've been able to do in recent years, I think, is encourage the World Trade Organization to become much more effective. And with the UK rejoining WTO, I think that's going to be a very important part of our mission over the next few years. And that could benefit trade in many, many countries. Could benefit trade in Africa, could benefit trade right through South America. It's going to be very important.
Edwina Currie, let's take the long view finally. You've seen 4 Conservative Prime Ministers effectively fall on the European issue: Margaret Thatcher, John Major, David Cameron, and of course Theresa May. Do you think there's any prospect of Europe re-emerging to haunt the Tory party, or is it going to be done with? Do you think the issue is finished for good, or do you think, given your long political experience, it might come back to bite you?
Oh, I think it will be done and dusted. There will be negotiations over many years. There are bound to be when we're an important trading partner and neighbour of the EU countries. But once we have achieved the sovereignty that we really want to have, indeed that we achieved when we left on January the 31st, but it doesn't look like the EU's got its head around what it means at all. I think that issue in political terms will fade. We haven't got a general election in the UK till 2024, by which time it'll be done and dusted. And we'll be looking more to see whether the long-term effects of coronavirus on the economy will have been dealt with, whether we're able to look to the future with confidence, and whether this wonderful country of ours will continue to play a very big part globally, as it always has done.
Edwina Currie, compliments of the season, and thank you once again for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
Look after yourself. Take care.
Join us after the break, where we turn to the north and west to see where Northern Ireland and Scotland figure in the continuing Brexit drama. Join us then. Welcome back. How is the impasse in Brussels being regarded in the Celtic nations of the UK? Parts of England may be gung-ho for Brexit, but Northern Ireland and Scotland voted Remain. So what are the long-term implications for the British Union from Boris's battles with Brussels? Alex is in conversation with former Ulster Unionist leader Mike Nesbitt MLA and chair of the House of Commons International Trade Committee, Angus MacNeil MP.
Mike Nesbitt, you seem to have got the best deal of the lot in Northern Ireland, a foot in both camps, in the single market, in the British market. Are you quite happy with the way things are going, regardless of what everybody else thinks?
Well, I know you guys over in Scotland are very envious of the economic possibilities for us, but politically we're not sitting pretty, because we think that the protocol, which of course comes into effect whether there's an overarching trade deal or not, really gives a lie to the thought that Brexit meant taking back control. Because during all the years and the decades when we were under the control of Brussels, there were very few restrictions on the movement of goods between any of the 4 constituent parts of the United Kingdom. But of course, once we took back control, the first thing the UK government had to do was negotiate with Brussels. And the outcome is this Northern Ireland Protocol, which means there are a lot more checks and restrictions on the movements of goods within the 4 constituent parts of the United Kingdom, particularly goods coming from England, Scotland or Wales into Northern Ireland. And, you know, that presses a button for unionists. We have a sense of sort of perpetual betrayal And the feeling is that Boris Johnson not only threw unionism onto the bus, he then got into the bus and reversed it back over us.
So Angus MacNeil, up there in Barra, I mean, how come Northern Ireland has effectively achieved the status that Scotland wanted? I mean, is that Boris Johnson's malevolence or is it Scottish incompetence?
Firstly, I'm very envious of Mike Nesbitt's situation, and he's only about 150 miles to the south of me here, directly from the Hebrides. And, you know, he's got options. Oh, that we had the same options, because our fishermen landing and their catch, 90% if you're going off the European markets, will have greater restrictions than anybody landing in Mike's area. So I do think that this has ended up with Northern Ireland in and there by accident. Nobody particularly seemed to want it in Northern Ireland, and Scotland did want it and didn't get it. And of course with both the parts of the UK that voted against Brexit. But fortunately for Northern Ireland and unfortunately for us, they've got the better of the two situations. And incidentally, the worst affected part of all of Europe, not just the UK, is going to be the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. So sometimes they're talking about the reunification of Ireland. Perhaps we should unify Scotland because of the capital city and decision-making somewhere else. We'd be better off having it in Dublin than having it in London. Of course, Edinburgh would be the best option of all.
Well, that's almost an invitation to a new Dalriada coming there from Angus MacNeil, Mike Nesbitt. Look, when you were saying earlier about Boris Johnson, the bus trundling over you, are you suggesting that in out to break up one union, the European Union, Boris Johnson may be endangering another union, the British Union?
I do. I've always felt that Brexit was an existential threat to the Union. And, you know, there's a sort of irony there in that for centuries rather than decades, Unionists have looked over their shoulder at Irish nationalists as the big threat to the Union. But of course, now that they are supplanted, I would suggest, by Scottish nationalism. And the real big threat is English nationalism. And I think English nationalism was what drove Brexit. And nobody who was an English nationalist gave much thought to the fact that if Brexit went ahead, they would be changing people's sense of identity here in this part of the United Kingdom in a way that the Belfast Good Friday Agreement said was not possible. Because, of course, in '98, we said that individuals define their own identity. They can be British or Irish or both. I think a lot of people here also embraced a sense of Europeanness and feel diminished because that sense of Europeanness was denied them by English nationalism in that Brexit referendum vote. So we do have to think about how we recalibrate relationships between the islands and go back to the three sets of relationships from that Belfast Good Friday Agreement: the internal relationships in Northern Ireland, the relationships north-south on the island, and east-west between the two islands.
Angus MacNeil, you're chair of the International Trade Committee of the House of Commons. Aren't you and your colleagues over-egging the pudding about the implications of Brexit? I mean, trade isn't going to grind to a standstill, and isn't Boris Johnson right to say there's these markets beckoning across the world if only Britain can step into them?
I suppose the truth is trade won't end, but, you know, trade's been on the go since the Stone Age, and we don't particularly want to go to that sort of level of trade. I mean, what we do have is the warning some reputable bodies such as the Road Haulage Association, which talk about trade being affected across the short English Channel crossing by about to 65 to 80% of the current volumes if there's a deal, and 40% to 65% if there's no deal. So either way, it's bad. The point about the new trade deals, and just to give some context about that, a no-deal Brexit will cost 7.6% of GDP, and a deal will about 4.9% of GDP. So let's put that into pounds for a comparison that's easy to understand. Say £7.60 and £4.90. Well, these deals, these free trade agreements that the UK government trumps, are worth the equivalent of the American deal, be worth about 20 pence. An Australian deal is worth about 2 to 3 pence. A New Zealand deal is worth about a penny. A Canadian deal is worth probably about 3 to 4 pence again. The Japan deal was worth nothing because we were already trading with a deal. So you're losing either £7.60 or £4.90, and you're gaining something like 27, 28 pence, 29 pence maybe in return. Now, if I take £7.60 away from you, Alec, and give you 29 pence in return, I think you'll feel your pockets an awful lot lighter. And that's a situation that Brexit and the Brexiteers are given as well, getting on TV and talking about shiny trade deals, but giving no context as to what they mean.
Well, Angus MacNeil, as a view from Barra, you've just brought it into the language of everyday people. But are your colleagues in the International Trade Committee, are they all convinced that Brexit is going to be the big problem that you're arguing it's going to be?
Well, I suppose there are a number of nuances that they've got to play it with. I mean, we've got Tory members there, and we know exactly the background that they're operating in. I better not speak for them, but I don't fear any contradiction, let's say, to what I've said. As I say, the Labour members are more in agreement with what I've been saying. I think, everybody you speak to, whether it's, as mentioned, the Road Haulage Association, the British Poultry Council, who said the price of UK chicken is going to go up in the UK, regardless of deal or no deal, either 5% or 25%. There's nobody I've spoken to in livestock, in medicine, human or animal, in manufacturing, that sees anything good from Brexit. They're all seeing damage, economic damage, and damage to their pockets and to people's jobs and livelihoods. Probably Northern Ireland was born out of a fear of the backwardness as was viewed of the Republic of Ireland 100 years ago. But the economic prospects for most people in these islands now we're looking at Ireland and we're seeing what they can do in the European Union, and we're wondering what the heck leaders in London have been up to, walking away from this. When they see the figures, these are their own government figures I was quoting incidentally, this is economically damaging, ruinous to jobs and ruinous to people's livelihoods and life chances. The work Marcus Rashford incidentally has done on food banks and on food for children, he might need to pull in the whole Manchester United team and the England team to get this sorted in future, such the difficulties are likely to be.
Mike Nesbitt, you've been renowned in Northern Irish politics for trying to take a long-term view of things. Give us some of that insight in where you think the deal, no deal, half a deal in Brussels is going to be in the long term for Northern Ireland, for Ireland and for the rest of the United Kingdom.
Well, I think long term, the reality is that business people adapt to whatever circumstances they are presented with. So what they need is certainty. They may not like the detail of the certainty, but they will take certainty and they'll mould it to their best advantage. But we haven't got to certainty yet. And two factors that I just find bemusing are the Brexiteers always seem to think that the EU 27 we're going to sit down around the table and say, well, we must give better trading arrangements to the United Kingdom than we're affording ourselves. And the second thing is this talk of the shiny new markets. I mean, are the EU 27 so stupid that they don't see these markets? And if I was one of those markets, the question is, would I rather negotiate with Boris Johnson, representing a marketplace of 67 million, or would I rather negotiate with Brussels and a marketplace of 470 or 480 million? There's just no logic to these arguments.
Mike Nesbitt, Bertie Ahern told me on this show a few months back that he could well understand why Britain wanted to develop new markets, but he couldn't understand is why they wanted to give up the ones they'd got. Is that something you'd agree with the former Irish Taoiseach on?
Absolutely. You build with what you've got. You don't dismantle it and take yourself down to ground zero and then try and start again. He's absolutely right. And, to a certain extent, Brexit has undone work that's been building since 1998 with the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, where relationships north and south of the border have become progressively better than they've ever been in history. And now, having been partners, having developed relationships and structures like the North-South Ministerial Council, Intertrade Ireland, which is an all-Ireland trade body, suddenly, because of Brexit, we're becoming rivals again. And that, to me, is a retrograde step.
Finally, Angus MacNeil, where's the future for Scotland? I mean, are you casting around looking at EFTA? Are you looking enviously to Iceland and to Norway? How are you going to re-establish these trading relationships with Europe that look in one way or another are going to be badly interrupted or severed over the next few months?
There's 2 points to answer that. I think the UK is now going to be the only major country in Western Europe not in the single market. As you mentioned, Iceland in EFTA, which is in the single market, Norway, Switzerland, all in the single market. It leaves the UK in a very peculiar position, a damaging position for those who are trading and selling and importing to the UK. one thing that gives me hope in the midst of all this madness, and Mike Nesbitt is quite right about the point of negotiations and destroying what you've got, is hopefully we can change and we can rebuild and return to what we had. And remembering the Highlands and Islands of Scotland will be the worst affected by this. But we're currently sitting in a period where 16 opinion polls in Scotland are giving majorities for Scottish independence. And I think people are seeing the stewardship, the bad stewardship that we've had from London very recently. And the hope is that we will turn this very big economic negative into a constitutional positive and emerge with an independent Scotland as a result of it. We will, of course, remember our good friends in Northern Ireland and be good friends and neighbours to them, as we will hopefully to England and everybody else as well.
Mike Nesbitt with the Ulster insignia behind you. Angus MacNeil with the saltire flying proudly behind you. Thank you so much for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
You're very welcome, Alex. Keep me sipping the Bushmill.
In Scotland, we're ruining the fact that we're the only UK nation not to get some of what we voted for. England and Wales voted leave and are leaving. Northern Ireland voted remain and is staying at least half in. But pro-European Scotland is being left out in the cold. The three sticking points in the negotiations remain the same: fisheries, the level playing field, and governance. At the end of the day, the price of fish, determined by market access, is more important than the quantities caught. While which court decides what and in which order is capable of a political fudge. However, the level playing field is more difficult, because here the Tories are victims of their own Singapore of the Atlantic rhetoric. The European Union is not going to concede favoured access to markets and a competitive advantage to its near neighbour. That pass is unlikely to be sold anytime soon, at least not cheaply. And thus, this year's Nair Day renditions of Auld Lang Syne may have a particular poignancy right across Europe. But for now, from Alex, myself and all at the show, stay safe and we'll see you again next week for our Christmas special.